I do read as many comments as I can, and it's taking quite a while these days. Thank you to all who do comment. And many asked why I singled out Ford for the one that's going bust in 2024, when VW, General Motors, Toyota and others are all in a similar, if not worse, financial position. Oh, very good point. Dave takes it on, looks at the others, and then why I chose Ford. Well, a good starting point here is to go back to basics and state the one fact that absolutely everyone misses. None of this will happen tomorrow. Now, I mentioned mobile phones in my Ford video, so let's go back there. Pre-iPhone, all phones had a mechanical keyboard. Yeah, I know there were a few, including Apple Newton. They did have touchscreens, but not finger touch. They needed a stylus, and those quickly got lost, and they never caught on. But they did establish the principle, touchscreens. So with keyboards, you press buttons. So most of these phones had a non-touch screen, did nothing else. So a command on the screen required you to press a button that was directly below or underneath the command. And one problem that we overlooked at the time was that a keyboard had to have a certain physical size. You could not make it so small, just to get a larger screen in, that you couldn't type individual keys, although BlackBerry came really close to it. Well, the Apple iPhone did away with the keyboard and the stylus, put in a proper processor, memory and screen, and put everything else into software. And it was a dramatic shift that eventually almost destroyed Nokia, previously the world's largest phone maker, with a physical keyboard, and all other phone manufacturers at that time. But you can go down to Tesco today, and you can buy a mobile phone with a keyboard. Hey, and in a bitter irony, one such phone, the cheapest, is a Nokia, and they still offer a flip phone for 2.5 times the price. Anyway, almost overnight in 2007, all mobile phone users all over the world switched to wanting an iPhone. Now note the word wanted, because the vast majority of people could not afford one, and some of those who could did not want to switch to Apple. They preferred their Android or Google or Windows or whatever their phone maker included. That was the point in time, the instance, when mobile phones with just a keyboard and no touchscreens were superseded. Now, for years after, even to this day, you can still go out and buy one. But almost everybody wanted one and were just waiting until their own manufacturer brought out their own version. And it was usually much cheaper than the iPhone. But those who'd recently upgraded to a new keyboard phone, they were in no rush, many were on contract, and they wouldn't pay the penalties to switch. Others wanted one, but just kept their old model, waiting till this newfangled technology either failed or got over the initial bugs and faults and settled down. By the way, if anyone recognises where this is going, well spotted. So people waited and found that the favourite manufacturers actually just stuck with keyboards, but then added new features to make them look better, but to no avail. It took a number of companies, the likes of Samsung, to jump on the bandwagon and finally make the switch. They made really compelling smartphones with almost the same features as the iPhone, sometimes even better, but at a much lower price, and that opened the floodgates. It also allowed the technology, touchscreens, to enter mass production so that other cheaper competitors could copy Samsung's copy of the iPhone. And that resulted in really cheap and sometimes nasty smartphones, but ones that everyone could afford. But today, 16 years later, you can still buy a phone with a keyboard, and people obviously do buy them. Okay, let's get back to cars. My first point is that the transition to EVs has already passed the point at which ICE cars are superseded. I believe that happened sometime in 2017 with the launch of the Tesla Model 3. But of course you can still buy a brand new ICE car today, 6 years later. And that is for the exact same reasons why people didn't all immediately go out and buy an iPhone. See, first, many people don't like change. That's fine. They've owned and driven ICE cars for their entire lives, liked them, got used to them. They didn't want to change. They also stuck with their favourite brand, and that brand may not yet have made the switch. Many own their own cars outright and they don't want to get back into debt, particularly not in a recession where everything costs more than ever. Others are in a finance agreement with some time left to run. But the vast majority, all except a really very tiny, absolutely trivial number of people, wanted one. They just couldn't afford one. Now, I guarantee, no matter what anyone says to the contrary, if you had offered them a Model 3 for free, they would snatch your hand off grabbing the keycard. Nobody but a total lunatic offered a free Tesla Model 3, no strings attached, would refuse it on the principle, well, we prefer ICE, or we hate Elon, or they think EVs will fail. Nobody. So, back to EVs. I believe the tipping point, or that period in time when the end of the ICE car occurred, was a few years ago. But here we get back to timescale. Just like you can still buy mobile phones with keyboards and no touchscreen, you will still be able to buy a new ICE car for at least another 12 years. To put that into context, most Google searches state that we keep our cars on average round about 8 years. Well, some people change every 2 years, and some hang on to them until they die a natural death, but 8 years is the average. So that means, as of today, you can buy your next one and the next one after that in the UK, and if you buy the last one shortly before the ban supposedly comes in 2035, then you can keep driving ICE until at least 2043. Well, should everyone buy an EV tomorrow? No, that's a stupid suggestion. There's no force involved. If you don't want to buy one, that's fine. If you want to buy an ICE car, it's also fine. If you have an ICE car already paid for, it's driving well, and finances do not look good, definitely don't buy an EV and lumber yourself with debt. If you have an existing ICE car on finance, keep it until the finance finishes. Then make your choice. But if you want to buy another ICE car when it ends, please go ahead. All I hope to achieve with my channel is to get you to look at EVs, not listen to the ranting media or the rantings of anti-Elon guys, but actually go and see one and drive it before you buy your next car. Well, back to VW and Toyota, Stellantis. Where are we to? Well, EVs have arrived and they've taken off with growth now exponential. We're now at the stage where EVs are well established. In fact, the best-selling car in the world is now an EV, and a premium EV at that. That point is very important. Legacy Auto, after initially ignoring EVs, then working actively to stop them taking hold, finally decided if you can't beat them or stop them, then they should have a go themselves. And so they did. But things didn't quite work out as they hoped. In their dominant position and with an arrogance that said simply, well, we're the experts, the world leaders, we've been making ICE car for over 100 years and we are really good at it, they found it wasn't quite so easy. I'll show here a very short clip, this really interesting interview of Jim Farley, CEO of Ford, stating this.
Car companies haven't written software like this.
Yeah.
Ever. They've never written software. So we're literally writing how the vehicle operates, the software to operate the vehicle for the first time ever.
Yeah.
Well, they believed totally it was going to be easy. After all, every ICE model refresh introduced over the last 100 years, say, incurred major changes that they'd previously overcome, and they all went on to prosper. But they found EVs were very different. All major legacy auto has come totally unstuck, failed, and is now in a total rethink phase. Ford, GM, Stellantis, VW, they've all announced recently huge, mind-boggling, massive losses on every single EV they sell. That's up to a massive $30,000 per vehicle in the case of Ford. Well, apart from GM, who don't publish that data, but they've publicly set a target of 2026, when they will begin to make a profit on EVs, implying they're losing money at the moment. Well, initial pre-orders and fast sales lulled them into a false belief that they'd cracked the switch to EVs. Recent sales figures now show the exact opposite. China, once their biggest market, now doesn't want them. And even in America, they're finding that dealers are fully stocked and cannot sell EVs, even heavily discounted. Meanwhile, the growth of EV sales continues, eating now into the market they've dominated for nearly 100 years. EVs, even in America, are nearing 10% of the entire auto market. Oh, people claim sales have just dropped dramatically, so nobody's buying them anymore. That is just not true. What has happened, well, it's probably best described by looking at inflation figures. Inflation in the UK reached a massive figure, 11.1% in October 2022, a year ago. It's a record high. Today, it's down to just 6.7%. That's an absolutely massive drop, almost 50% drop in inflation. But inflation is still at 6.7%, meaning our prices are continuing to rise at a very scary pace, about 3 times what it normally should be, which is really bad. It's just not as bad or as scary as it was a year ago. Yeah, the rate of growth of new EV sales has dropped, but the EV industry is still selling many, many times more than a year ago, dramatically more. And sales are increasing very nicely, just at a slower rate than they would have liked. The reasons why they've dropped is another video I'll be releasing shortly, but just accept the sale of EVs is higher this year than last year for most EV makers. So where does this leave the ICE industry? Okay, well, how a company handles this transition is the key to their success in the future. If a company recognises what's going on, reacts accordingly, they can survive. If they just bury their heads in the sand and carry on as before, hoping all will be well, they will fail. Ford is already looking at this process. They have recently separated out the core businesses into 3 companies. One dealing with legacy auto, that's Ford Blue. One dealing with the commercial vehicles, that's Ford Pro. And the third dealing with EVs, that's Ford E. Well, the main reason for doing this is to do with their financial liabilities. You see, if Ford stayed as a single entity, and if EVs really did totally take over, and if ICE car sales did continue to decline, even declining exponentially, then the eventual collapse of the ICE business would collapse the entire company, EV, commercial, and all. As separate companies, they split their liabilities. If ICE sales continue to decline and suddenly drop below the point of mass production, where the costs will dramatically rise, and they start losing money, as particularly likely now that the UAW has just lumbered them with massively increased costs, then they can collapse that branch of the company, blame the unions, and continue with 2 very profitable companies. In other words, I believe Ford has seen that their ICE business has a very limited lifespan left and forecasts the inevitable collapse, and they're doing what they can to make sure that Ford, in one form or another, will survive and prosper. Well, Jim Farley was the very first CEO of any legacy company who went along and talked to Tesla a long time before they knew just how serious and terminal the problem with EVs was. That is why Ford will likely go bankrupt in 2024, but now not the whole thing. I believe they will collapse the Ford Blue, the ICE side of the company. The recession is really taking home. Interest rates are at a very scary high, and EVs are now cheaper than ICE. Now, for those of you who cling and cite the belief that EVs are too dear, just look at America. The US average price of a new car in 2023 stands at $45,000. And the Tesla Model 3 and Y are not just cheaper, but dramatically cheaper. The Model 3 refresh basic model now starts at $39,000. And the long range at $46,000. So that already makes them very competitive for a premium car. But customers get $7,500 off that price with incentives from the IRA, initiated by the federal government, in Inflation Reduction Act, and often more from state incentives. This puts the Model 3, a premium car, at under $30,000 for many buyers in America. Well, even if people don't like EVs, hate them, despise Elon Musk, some of them are going to buy them because of the ridiculously cheap price alone. Well, VW are on a very different route. They had an initial success with EVs and were an early producer of some quite good EVs. But after the rush of the early adopters, who'll buy anything at any price in order to be the first to get one, sales are proving harder to come by. They have an impressive sales performance this first half of 2023. EV sales are up about 50% in Europe, while the US and China, well, they're very different. They're showing a decline. They are in a good position to survive, but they face a massive internal battle or war that's already cost them one CEO, Herman Diess. VW face some very difficult choices and decisions, but if they make the right ones, they can survive and prosper. I fear they may not, and in that case the end will be very slow and very long drawn out. Definitely not the first to go, but quite likely to go anyway. Toyota's unusual, and it has huge loyalty, especially in Japan, the home market, but this will not save them in the long term. Well, Toyota's still very much in the denial phase. ICE, definitely we're still making them. EVs, well, not really, customers don't want them. Maybe we'll do hydrogen, or maybe if we can develop a solid-state battery to give people a 1,000-mile range. They have no clear plan. And as such, they will plod on until either they just gradually go bust, or they make a decision on the next phase of vehicle production and get on with it. They're quite capable of doing it. Once again, I fear they will delay too long and end up like Nokia. Oh, now, before anyone says it, I know Nokia is still a thriving business, but look at the graph. Within 5 years of the launch of the iPhone, the turnover had collapsed from 60 billion to a negative 5 billion loss, where they repurposed the company to accept the new reality of smartphones before recovering to today's 25 billion. Nice thriving company, but only a small percentage of that is now coming from the sale of phones and smartphones. Today, Nokia offers things like fixed networks, IP routing, private networks, optical networks, data centers, radio controllers, IoT, Internet of Things, and 5G services. And they sell a few mobile phones and smartphones. They accepted the reality and diversified, and they've succeeded. It can be done. Stellantis, strange one, is such a diverse group of companies, it's difficult to see where this one ends. I suspect they will make disastrous decisions amongst internal infighting, and they'll just break up totally as specific loss-making divisions are collapsed year after year until there's not very much left at all. But as a group, they could plod on for many years. So, Ford still is, in my opinion, likely to be the first one that actually goes bust, but only the ICE part of it, Ford Blue. The Ford E company, I think, has a great future. They've got a good CEO who's starting to recognise the problems and he's wanting to do something about it. Well, thanks for watching to the end. I'll be following these stories as they develop and time will tell who got it right. In the meantime, I do welcome comments from my viewers. Who agrees? Who totally disagrees? I'm Dave.